If you've ever worked in a place where the writing was on the wall long before the final blow landed, you know exactly the kind of feeling I lived with for months. A tightness in your chest every time a meeting invite hits your inbox. A nervous glance over your shoulder in every hallway. A constant itch under your skin that something's not right, even when everyone smiles at you like everything is just fine. That was my life at Redmont Solutions. I had been there for almost 6 years, slowly climbing the ladder until I landed what I thought was my dream role, head of community engagement. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. We worked with nonprofits, planned events, handled company volunteer days. It was the part of the business that made the cold, profit-hungry engine look human. And for a while, it worked. Our campaigns won awards. Our partnerships boosted Redmont's public image by miles. I had a team of 5, a decent budget, actual creative freedom. But then last year the winds shifted. A new CFO came in, Richard Holloway. The kind of guy who treated anything that wasn't directly tied to quarterly profit margins like dead weight. He didn't even bother learning what we did before he slashed our department's budget. Not reduced. Eliminated. $0. It was almost impressive how quickly it happened. One day I was planning a new campaign for local schools. The next I was sitting in a fluorescent-lit conference room, listening to Holloway explain, without even flinching, that community engagement will need to find ways to be more self-sustaining. Self-sustaining. With no money. No vendors. No event spaces. No supplies. We weren't a department anymore, we were a ghost. At first, I fought back the only way I knew how, working harder. I rallied my team, got creative, pulled favors from old contacts, organized volunteer events using free venues, printed flyers at home, begged sponsors to cover minor costs. We did everything short of paying for things out of our own pockets. And somehow we kept the wheels turning. For a while. But you can only patch up a sinking ship for so long before the whole thing starts pulling you under. Missed targets. Declining engagement. Fewer press mentions. A slip in the quarterly corporate responsibility metrics. And every single one of those failures came back with my name on them. Suddenly, Richard was CCing me on emails to the board. Subtle at first. Little hints about how community engagement is not meeting projected outcomes. No mention of the fact that he had stolen every resource we had. No mention of the fact that my team was working unpaid overtime just to keep us breathing. No, just me. Just failure. It wasn't long before the whispers started. Coworkers avoiding my eye in the break room. Hushed conversations that stopped when I walked by. A few people who used to praise my work suddenly too busy to return calls. I knew what was coming. The setup was obvious now. They were turning me into the scapegoat. Make it look like my failure, not the company's greed. And once enough people bought into that narrative, it would be easy for Richard to recommend restructuring my role right out the door. I should have been terrified. Maybe part of me was. But mostly I was furious. Not just for me. For my team, the people who had busted their asses for a company that saw them as disposable. For every charity, every school, every community partner who believed we actually cared, only to find out we were just a line item waiting to be erased. And in that fury, something unexpected bloomed. Clarity. I realized something very simple. If they were going to come for me, I wasn't going quietly. If they wanted to burn me at the stake, I was going to light the match myself. But I was going to aim it somewhere a hell of a lot more painful than they ever expected. I wasn't going to fight them behind closed doors. I was going to fight them where they couldn't bury it. Right in front of the entire board. And I already knew exactly how I was going to do it. The thing about corporate backstabbing is that it's rarely loud. It's quiet. Subtle. Death by 1,000 little emails and side conversations you're never part of. But I wasn't planning to go quietly. I was done playing their game. It was time to make a move they wouldn't expect, something public, something they couldn't spin or shove under a rug. And it had to be perfect. I spent the next few days acting like nothing had changed. I showed up to work on time, answered emails, sat through meetings where Richard rattled off buzzwords about cost optimization and growth mindset while everyone around him nodded like brainwashed zombies. I nodded too, smiled when appropriate, played my part. All the while I was crafting something bigger behind the scenes. An email. One email. But not just a rant or a meltdown that would only give them what they wanted. An excuse to call me unprofessional and shove me out the door faster. No, this email had to be surgical. Sharp, precise, unarguable. It had to show, with receipts, exactly how badly they had sabotaged community engagement, and how that sabotage would eventually hurt Redmont far more than any quarterly report ever could show. I pulled out every number I had access to. The year-over-year community engagement growth before Richard slashed our budget. The awards we'd won. The partnerships that had directly led to client contracts now at risk because our relationships were crumbling without support. I dug through emails too, carefully, legally. Nothing confidential. Just messages from executives praising our work, thanking us for lifting Redmont's public image after some very public scandals a few years earlier. I built a timeline. Pre-Richard, growth, success, national recognition. Post-Richard, budget cut to zero, performance tanked, team morale destroyed. I stacked it neatly, layer by layer, brick by damning brick. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't bitter. It was cold, hard facts. By the time I finished, it read less like a complaint and more like a case study in self-sabotage. At the bottom, I drafted one final paragraph. Short, direct, devastating. If Redmont Solutions truly values its future reputation, I would strongly urge the board to ask why the Community Engagement Department was set up to fail, and who stood to gain from that failure. No names. No accusations. Just a gentle, sharpened nudge toward the truth. Because the real killer wasn't the data itself. It was the implication. Anyone reading that email would have no choice but to start asking questions. And once the questions started, the whole rotten mess would unravel. Richard wouldn't just lose me as a scapegoat. He'd have to answer for the entire crumbling narrative he had built. Now came the hard part. Timing. If I sent it too soon, before they made their move against me, it would look defensive. Reactive, weak. But if I waited too long, they might force me out and strip my access, cut me off before I could pull the trigger. I had to pick the perfect moment, the moment when they thought they had already won. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, I was called into a performance review meeting. No warning. No agenda. Just an invite from HR and Richard. I knew exactly what was waiting for me. They were going to corner me. Blame me for everything. Push me to resign gracefully so they wouldn't have to deal with the optics of firing me after gutting my department. Good. Let them think they had the upper hand. I RSVP'd yes. Politely. Smiled as I walked out of my office. But inside I was ready. My draft email was sitting in my inbox, addressed to every single member of the executive board, scheduled to send 30 minutes after the meeting started. No regrets. No second guessing. They wanted a spectacle. They were about to get one. The meeting was in one of those small, glass-walled conference rooms where you feel like an exhibit on display for the rest of the office. You can see everyone passing by, pretending not to stare, pretending they don't know exactly what's happening behind the glass. It was just Richard, the HR manager, and me. The HR manager, a woman named Dana who had never so much as said good morning to me before, opened a manila folder and started reading from a piece of paper like a news anchor delivering bad headlines. After a review of departmental outcomes, concerning recent engagement metrics, in light of performance expectations not being met. I barely heard her. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I wasn't scared anymore. I knew something they didn't. In 25 minutes, the entire executive board was going to get an email that would change the conversation permanently. Richard sat there pretending to look concerned. He folded his hands neatly on the table, gave those sympathetic head tilts like he was so disappointed things had come to this. I wanted to laugh right in his face. Instead, I nodded along, just enough to keep the charade alive. Dana droned on for another few minutes, listing every supposed failure under my leadership, all of them neatly ignoring the fact that my budget had been ripped out from under me like a magician's trick gone wrong. Then Richard cleared his throat, lacing his fingers together like a patient father talking to a wayward child. "We think it would be best for everyone if you resigned voluntarily," he said, voice smooth as butter. "We'll offer a neutral reference. No need for things to get messy." Messy? I almost smiled. Right on cue. I glanced down at my watch. 10 minutes until the email went out. I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the table in front of me, and gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I appreciate the feedback," I said, my voice calm. "If you don't mind, I'd like to take a few moments to think it over before making any decisions." Richard smiled, clearly thinking he had won. Dana gave a relieved little nod and slid a resignation letter template across the table toward me. I picked it up, skimmed it casually, and tucked it into my notebook without saying a word. "Of course," Richard said, standing up, "take all the time you need." I stood too, shook their hands like a good little soldier, and walked out of the room. I didn't go back to my desk. I didn't check my email. I just walked outside, letting the sharp autumn air hit my face like a slap. It was done now. The email would send itself automatically, scheduled perfectly to land in every board member's inbox while they were still digesting whatever version of events Richard was feeding them. I pictured it in my head, the blinking notifications lighting up smartphones, the sudden rush of confused whispers, the angry meetings that would follow. Inside that email was a truth they couldn't ignore. Cold numbers. Clear evidence. A timeline too clean, too brutal to dismiss. And worst of all, no rage. No whining. No excuses. Just the fact. I didn't accuse anyone by name, but anyone with half a brain would connect the dots straight back to Richard and the decisions he made, decisions that had directly sabotaged the department he now claimed I had failed to manage. I sat in my car, staring at the Redmont Solutions building for what felt like hours. Not with sadness. Not with anger. With peace. They thought they could bury me quietly. Erase me like an inconvenience. Instead, I had put a spotlight on every corner they had tried to hide. Made it impossible for them to tell the neat little story they had rehearsed. I knew there would be fallout. Meetings, investigations. Finger pointing. I didn't know if it would save my job, and honestly, I didn't care. Because it wasn't about staying anymore. It was about refusing to be silenced. It was about standing up, not because you think you'll win, but because you refuse to let cowards win by default. And as the first panicked phone call from an unknown number lit up my screen, I knew one thing for sure. They weren't in control anymore. I was. By the time I pulled into my driveway that evening, my phone had already buzzed at least a dozen times. Voicemails, emails, texts from numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't answer any of them. I knew exactly what they said. I wasn't worried. Instead, I went inside, kicked off my shoes, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat on my balcony, watching the sunset bleed across the sky like spilled paint. For the first time in months, I wasn't carrying the weight of what-ifs and maybes on my back. I had dropped my truth into the heart of their well-oiled machine. And now I was letting it do what truth always does when you let it breathe: burn. It didn't take long for the fallout to go public. The next morning, I woke up to an inbox full of forwarded emails from former coworkers, little whispers of chaos leaking from the inside. One email caught my eye immediately, sent from a senior board member, accidentally CCing half the executive team. We need to pause all performance-related terminations effective immediately until a full review of the community engagement department's situation is complete. Another, we need clarification regarding budget reallocation decisions, who authorized these changes without board oversight. And another, urgent meeting scheduled 3:00 p.m., attendance mandatory, topic damage control. I couldn't help but chuckle as I sipped my coffee. The panic was bleeding through their carefully controlled, professional language. They weren't just annoyed. They were scared. Later that afternoon, Jenna, a friend still stuck in that crumbling office, called me under the guise of catching up. She sounded half thrilled, half terrified. "They're losing their minds," she whispered. "The board's furious. No one knows how you got all that information so organized, it's airtight." I didn't tell her how much time I had spent building it. The late nights cross-referencing emails. The spreadsheets color-coded until my eyes hurt. No one at Redmont ever saw the work I did behind the scenes. They only noticed when things didn't magically work out in their favor. Now they were finally noticing. "They're throwing Richard under the bus," Jenna added, almost gleeful. "He's been called into 3 emergency meetings already today. Word is he's blaming process failures and miscommunication. Total meltdown." I thanked her for the intel, kept my tone light but inside. I felt a grim satisfaction settle deep in my chest. It wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about justice. About standing tall when they wanted me to shrink. About forcing the truth into the daylight when they tried to bury it in a grave of polite lies. I didn't know exactly what would happen next. Maybe they'd clean house. Maybe they'd offer me some pathetic apology and a desperate plea to stay. Maybe they'd offer me a settlement to walk away quietly and save face. None of it mattered. Because no matter what, I had already won. Not because I beat them at their own game, but because I refused to keep playing it. I finished my coffee, feeling the tension melt out of my body for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. I wasn't someone's scapegoat anymore. I wasn't someone's convenient fall guy. I was my own person, standing tall, shoulders back, with no apologies left to give. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the city lights blinking to life one by one, I knew something deep in my bones. They had tried to silence me. Instead, I had forced them to listen. And they would never forget it. It's funny how quickly the tone changes when people realize they're not invincible. When I walked back into the Redmont building later that week, because yes, I still showed up, just to see it all with my own eyes, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Not a word was spoken, but you could feel it in the air. Every whispered conversation. Every nervous glance. Every fake smile that didn't quite reach anyone's eyes. I didn't sit at my desk. Didn't open my laptop. I just walked slowly, deliberately through the halls, letting myself absorb the crumbling facade. And then, as if fate was rewarding me for my patience, I caught sight of Richard himself. He was standing outside the boardroom, jaw tight, shuffling through papers with shaking hands. Waiting to be called inside. Waiting for judgment. I didn't stop to gloat. Didn't even acknowledge him. I just kept walking, the ghost of a smile tugging at my mouth. Because I knew what was happening behind that heavy, polished door. I knew the board had convened a full investigation into resource mismanagement and departmental sabotage. I knew they had pulled financial records, the real ones, not the sanitized reports Richard liked to wave around during monthly updates. I knew they had demanded meeting minutes, email threads, project timelines. And there, in cold black and white, was every decision he had made. Every corner he cut. Every lie he told. Every move he made to line his own pockets at the expense of the very community work he once dismissed as fluff. It was all there. Undeniable. undeniable because I had made sure of it. The final nail came 2 days later. An all-hands email blasted out to every employee at Redmont. Effective immediately, Richard Holloway is no longer employed by Redmont Solutions. We thank him for his contributions and wish him well in his future endeavors. The usual corporate spin. But everyone knew the truth. Richard wasn't leaving voluntarily. He wasn't moving on to new opportunities. He had been fired, thrown out by the very system he thought he controlled. The king who thought he was untouchable toppled in a single brutal stroke. And the best part, it wasn't just Richard. The board didn't stop there. A full audit of upper management practices was ordered. Suddenly, the company's obsession with slashing budgets while bragging about record profits didn't seem so clever to the people paying attention. New policies were rolled out. Transparency requirements. Community investment protections. Mandatory oversight committees. For once, Redmont was being forced to act like the company they always pretended to be. And me. I had a choice to make. About a week after Richard's termination, I was called into another meeting, this time with the new interim CEO, a woman named Helen who actually knew my name without glancing at a folder. She thanked me sincerely for my courage in highlighting systemic failures. She offered me a promotion. A raise. A chance to rebuild the community engagement department, properly this time with full board support. It should have felt like vindication. It should have been everything I wanted. But sitting there in that polished conference room, looking at the same sterile walls that had once closed in around me, I realized something important. I didn't want to rebuild what they had broken. Not here. Not for them. I had proven my point. I had stood my ground. I had forced change. But that didn't mean I owed them my future. I politely declined the offer. Left on my own terms. Head held high. Because sometimes winning isn't about getting everything you thought you wanted. Sometimes it's about walking away knowing they could never diminish you again. Not because they didn't try, but because you refused to let them. And as I packed the last few things from my desk, a framed photo, a worn coffee mug, a few forgotten pens, I realized I wasn't just leaving a job behind. I was leaving behind the version of myself who ever thought I needed their approval to be worth something. I stepped out into the sunlight, feeling lighter than I had in years. The fight was over. And I had won. On my terms. It's strange how, once you finally step out of a toxic place, the world feels bigger, lighter, more alive. Leaving Redmont wasn't just walking out of a building, it was stepping out of a box I didn't even realize I'd been crammed into for years. The first week was disorienting. No endless emails. No fake emergencies. No tight meetings designed to suck every ounce of creativity and energy from you before noon. I slept late. Took walks with no destination. Sat in coffee shops, just watching the world move without me having to push it forward. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I hadn't dared to ask in a long time. What do I actually want? Not what's safest. Not what looks good on a resume. Not what other people expect. What do I want? It didn't come to me in a thunderclap. It was quieter. Like the slow, steady tide pulling me toward something I had always known deep down. I wanted to build something that mattered. But this time I wanted to do it on my terms. So I started small. At first it was just freelance consulting, helping small businesses and nonprofits organize their community outreach, improve their messaging, avoid the soul-crushing mistakes Redmont had made. Word spread faster than I expected. 1 client turned into 3. 3 turned into 7. 7 turned into a waiting list. I wasn't chasing boardroom approval anymore. I wasn't drowning in bureaucratic nonsense. I was actually helping people. Actually making a difference. And even better, I was respected for it. Every time I walked into a meeting now, it was because someone genuinely valued my experience, not because they needed a scapegoat. The money wasn't flashy. Not at first. But it was enough, more than enough when you factored in the freedom, the dignity, the peace of mind. And slowly, that tiny whisper inside me, the one that had been telling me for years that I wasn't meant to live trapped in someone else's vision, grew louder. Clearer. One day, about 6 months after I left Redmont, I sat in my living room, laptop balanced on my knees, and realized. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a patch until I found another corporate job. This was it. My life. My business. My rules. I officially registered my company that afternoon, a small consulting firm specializing in community-driven marketing and engagement strategies. I called it True North Consulting. Because after everything, I had finally found mine. It wasn't just about making a living anymore. It was about making a life. The kind where I could say no to projects that didn't feel right. The kind where I could work with people who actually wanted to build good things. The kind where I could take a Tuesday off to hike a trail just because the sky was blue and the world felt full of possibilities. Sometimes when I thought about Redmont, about Richard, about all the nonsense I'd survived, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Not anger. Not bitterness. Gratitude. Because if they hadn't tried to bury me, I never would have realized I could fly. If they hadn't tried to cut me down to nothing, I never would have found the part of me that refuses to stay small. They thought they were ending my story. They were just clearing the stage for something bigger. Something better. And the best part, I didn't need a boardroom full of suits to tell me I was enough. I already knew. I was free. Truly, finally free. And no budget cut, no performance review, no petty corporate snake could ever take that away again. It's funny how success looks nothing like I thought it would. Back when I was stuck in the Redmont hamster wheel, success was a title. A bigger office. A bonus if you played your cards right and smiled at all the right people. It was performative. External. Success meant being seen, being praised, being chosen. But now success looks like waking up on a Monday without dread knotted in my stomach. It looks like drinking coffee slowly because I can, because there's no one breathing down my neck about pointless deadlines. It looks like choosing my work, my clients, my life every single day. And when I think about the old version of me, the one who sat in sterile conference rooms being told he wasn't enough, I don't feel pity. I feel pride. Because he didn't give up. He didn't fold when they pushed. He found the fire buried under all the fear and used it to build something they could never touch. That fire didn't make me reckless. It made me free. True North grew faster than I could have imagined. Small businesses, nonprofits, even a few major companies started reaching out, people tired of the cold, corporate nonsense who wanted to work with someone real. Someone who remembered that marketing wasn't about manipulation, it was about connection. I hired my first 2 employees, people I trusted, people who shared the same belief that work could be both good and good for you. We didn't have fancy offices. We didn't have endless budgets. But we had something Redmont never could offer, purpose. Real human purpose. Some days when I'm packing for a quick getaway, because now I can actually travel without begging for approval, I catch myself smiling for no reason. Because I'm not chasing anything anymore. Not approval. Not validation. Not survival. I'm building. Choosing. Living. And sure, it's not always easy. There are hard days. Slow month. Doubts that creep in when you least expect them. But even on the worst days, I know one thing with absolute certainty. I would choose this messy, beautiful, real life 1,000 times over the polished, poison life I left behind. The final irony. Redmont Solutions eventually made headlines. Not for success. Not for innovation. For a massive scandal, mismanaged funds, inflated reports, broken promises. The very culture Richard had helped build eventually ate itself alive from the inside. A few former colleagues reached out afterward, congratulating me for getting out when I did. I smiled and thanked them. But inside, I knew the truth. I didn't just get out. I chose better. I fought for better. And I built better not just for me, but for the people who would come after me. Sometimes I wonder if Richard ever thinks about me. If the board ever remembers the email that started it all. Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. It doesn't really matter. Because the real victory isn't that they lost. It's that I won. Not by beating them at their own game, but by walking away from the game entirely. And building a new one. One where I'm the only one who gets to say when I've succeeded. One where my value isn't decided in a boardroom, but in the quiet, steady beating of my own heart. One where freedom is the only title I'll ever need.